We like to think our homes are our sanctuaries. We pay for the privilege of a locked door and the absolute assumption of privacy. We undress, we sleep, and we talk to ourselves, all under the comfort of being unobserved. But privacy is a fragile illusion that relies entirely on the boundaries of the people living on the other side of the drywall. This happened to me 3 years ago in a historic brownstone in Chicago. It was a beautiful building, but it had a secret tucked away in its layout. And I haven't felt truly alone in a room since the night I found it. I lived in Unit 4B. My neighbor in 4C was a man named Mr. Henderson. He was exactly the kind of neighbor you hope for. Quiet, invisible, and remarkably predictable. He was a tall, thin man who always wore the same charcoal overcoat. He left for work at 8 a.m. and returned at 6 p.m. We exchanged short, polite nods in the hallway, but nothing more. No small talk, no complaints. He was a ghost in a suit. One Tuesday night, I decided to finally make the place feel like home. I had purchased a heavy, antique mirror and decided to hang it in my narrow hallway, right on the shared wall that divided my unit from Henderson's. I was using a digital stud finder to locate the beams, but the device was acting strange. It would beep frantically, then go dead. Frustrated, I decided to trust my gut. I took a small drill bit to make a pilot hole, hoping to feel the resistance of a wooden stud. As the drill pierced the outer layer of the drywall, something felt wrong. The bit didn't hit wood. It just slipped through as if the wall were made of paper. The drill surged forward, sinking all the way to the chuck. It had slipped into empty air on the other side. I pulled the drill back slowly, and a tiny puff of white dust hit the floor. I leaned in, curious about why the wall felt so hollow. I closed one eye and put the other to the tiny dark hole. At first it was just darkness, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I wasn't looking into Henderson's apartment. I was looking into a gap. It was a crawl space, a narrow maintenance void between our units. And then I saw the light. It was a faint, bluish glow coming from about 10 feet down the interior of the dark channel. My heart began to thud against my ribs. I took a flathead screwdriver and carefully widened the hole. I looked again. It was a monitor. A small glowing tablet screen sitting on a makeshift wooden ledge bolted to the interior beams of the wall. And on that screen, in high-definition night vision, was my living room. I could see my sofa, my coffee table, and the very hallway I was standing in. The realization trickled in like ice water. The glitchy stud finder, the eerie quietness of Unit 4C, the way Henderson always knew when I was leaving. It wasn't that he was a good neighbor. It was that he was never actually in his own apartment. He lived in the gaps. He lived in the walls. I stayed frozen, paralyzed by pure horror. I watched myself on the monitor, the back of my own head as I leaned against the wall. Then the silence of the crawl space was broken. I heard a soft, rhythmic scraping sound coming from inside the wall. It was moving toward my hole. Scratch. Click. Scratch. I didn't move. I couldn't even bring myself to blink. A shadow crossed the blue light of the monitor inside the wall. Someone was crawling through the narrow gap, dragging their body across the beams. I held my breath, my eyes still pressed to the hole. The movement stopped. Suddenly, the tiny circle of light from the hole vanished. It went pitch black. I realized that the light hadn't gone out. Something had blocked it. Something on the other side was now looking back through the exact same hole. We were eye to eye, separated by an inch of hollow space. Then, heard the whisper. It was so close that it felt like it was vibrating inside my own skull. It was Henderson's voice, raspy and terrifyingly calm. I liked the mirror better where it was, Marcus. It covered the old hole much better. I didn't wait for another word. I bolted for the front door and ran down the 4 flights of stairs. I didn't stop until I reached a 24-hour diner blocks away. When the officers finally broke into Unit 4C the next morning, they found exactly what I feared. The apartment was a shell, no furniture, no food, just a single chair facing the shared wall and a hidden door in the back of the bedroom closet that led directly into the maintenance void. Henderson was gone. He had vanished into the night before the police arrived. He's still out there. But every time I move into a new place now, I take a flashlight, I go to every wall, and I check for the holes. Because you never really know who is living on the other side of the paint. There is a specific kind of peace that comes with living in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. You grow accustomed to the rhythms of the neighborhood, the sound of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings, the distant bark of a dog, and the soft glow of porch lights flickering on at dusk. We moved into our home on Miller Court, specifically for that silence. My neighbor to the left was a man named Arthur. He was in his late 60s, a retired widower who kept his property in pristine condition. He was the kind of man who spent 8 hours a day manicuring his lawn and trimming his hedges with surgical precision. But about 3 months after we moved in, Arthur's daytime routine stopped, and his nighttime ritual began. It started on a humid Tuesday in July. I had woken up around 3 a.m. to get a glass of water, and as I walked past the kitchen window, I saw a faint, rhythmic flash of light in Arthur's backyard. I leaned against the sink, squinting into the darkness. There was Arthur, dressed in his usual flannel shirt and work boots, standing in the middle of his lawn. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, holding a long-handled shovel, illuminated by a small camping lantern on the grass. I watched for a moment, confused. Then he began to dig. He wasn't gardening. He wasn't planting a tree. He was digging a hole that was far too narrow and far too deep for any kind of landscaping. The sound of the shovel hitting the dry earth was a dull, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the glass of my window. He worked with a strange, frantic energy, his shadow dancing against the fence as he threw piles of dirt into a wheelbarrow. After about 20 minutes, he stopped, dropped a heavy black plastic bag into the hole, and began to fill it back in. He spent another hour tamping down the dirt until the ground was perfectly level again. Then he took a bag of grass seed, covered the spot, and went back inside. I told myself it was just an old man's eccentricity. Maybe he was burying a pet, or perhaps his mind was starting to wander in his old age. But the next night it happened again. Same time, same lantern, different spot in the yard, and then again the night after that. By the end of the week, Arthur's backyard was a patchwork of freshly seeded circles. I became obsessed with the window. I would sit in the dark kitchen with my own lights off, watching him work. There was something ritualistic about it. He never looked up. He never checked to see if anyone was watching. He just dug, dropped a bag, and buried it. The curiosity eventually turned into a cold, gnawing dread. I started noticing things I'd missed before. I hadn't seen Arthur leave his house for groceries in weeks. No mail was being picked up from his box. And most unsettlingly, the charcoal grill on his patio, which used to be spotless, was now covered in a thick, greasy soot that didn't look like wood smoke. One night, the wind shifted toward our house while he was working. I cracked the window just an inch, and a smell hit me that I will never forget. It was sweet, cloying, and metallic, like rotting fruit mixed with old copper. I decided I couldn't wait any longer. The next afternoon, while Arthur's house sat silent and dark, I climbed over the shared wooden fence. My heart was hammering so hard, I thought it might burst through my chest. I walked toward the most recent patch of fresh dirt. I didn't have a shovel, but the earth was still soft and loose. I began to pull away the dirt with my bare hands. I only had to go down about 2 feet before my fingers hit the plastic. It was a heavy-duty contractor bag, tied tight with a zip tie. I reached for my pocket knife to slice it open, but I stopped when I felt the shape of what was inside. It wasn't a pet. It wasn't trash. It was something solid, heavy, and unmistakably shaped like a human hand. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked toward Arthur's back door, expecting him to be standing there, but the house remained still. I scrambled back over the fence, ran inside, and called the police. When the sirens finally echoed through the cul-de-sac, I stood on my porch, shaking. The officers broke down Arthur's door, but they didn't find him. What they found instead was even worse. The man I'd been waving to for months. The man I thought was Arthur wasn't Arthur at all. The real Arthur Gable had been found in the basement, deceased for over 2 months. The man living in his house, the man digging in the yard at 3 a.m., was a squatter who'd been systematically cleaning out the house and burying the evidence in small, manageable pieces. They dug up 14 bags in that backyard. 14. They never caught the man. He had slipped out the front door the moment he heard the sirens. Now when I look out my kitchen window at night, I don't see a quiet neighborhood. I see a graveyard. And every time I hear the sound of a shovel hitting dirt, I think about who might be standing in the darkness. Moving into a new neighborhood usually comes with predictable social expectations. You wave at the person across the street, and eventually you get the inevitable invitation to dinner. But the invitation I received from the couple at the end of the block was the beginning of a nightmare I still haven't recovered from. They had moved in during a rainstorm, and remarkably, I never saw a moving truck. One day the house was empty, and the next, there were curtains in the windows and a dark sedan in the driveway. The man introduced himself as Elias. He was tall, dressed in a sharp, slightly outdated suit, and he spoke with a precision that felt rehearsed. A week after they arrived, I found a handwritten note on my car. It said, "We would be honored to host you for dinner tonight at 7. Neighbors should not remain strangers." I decided to go, figured it was a small price to pay for being neighborly. When I walked up to their porch, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No TV, no music, not even the hum of an air conditioner. Elias opened the door before I could even ring the bell. He ushered me inside with a wide, fixed smile. As soon as I stepped over the threshold, a cold knot formed in my stomach. The house was a shell. The hardwood floors were bare. There were no rugs, no lamps, and no photos on the walls. There wasn't a single piece of furniture in the living room. The echo of our footsteps was deafening, bouncing off the white, empty walls. Elias didn't seem to notice. He led me toward the dining room, talking about the charms of the neighborhood in a rhythmic, mechanical voice. In the center of the dining room sat a single cheap folding card table and 3 plastic lawn chairs. A woman I assumed was his wife was already sitting there. She was dressed in a formal evening gown that looked 20 years old. Her hair pinned back so tightly it looked painful. She didn't stand up. She just stared at the center of the table with a vacant, pleasant expression. The meal was already served. It was a large roast on a silver platter. But as I sat down, I realized something was wrong. There was no steam, no smell of herbs or fat. It looked like a prop, perfectly shaped but entirely lifeless. Elias picked up a knife and fork, but he didn't cut the meat. He just held the utensils over the plate, frozen in a pose of someone about to eat. We sat in that hollow room for 30 minutes. I tried to make conversation, asking where they moved from. Every time I asked a question, Elias would tilt his head, wait for 5 seconds, and then give a nonsense answer. When I asked about his job, he simply said the collection of data is vital for the maintenance of the structure. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my neck. I looked at the roast again, and this time, I saw a small crack in the side. It wasn't meat. It was painted plaster. My heart began to race. These people weren't eccentric. They were performing. They were trying to act out the concept of a dinner party without understanding what a dinner party actually was. The breaking point came when I heard a muffled, rhythmic thumping coming from beneath the floorboards. Thump, thump, thump. Elias didn't flinch. His wife didn't blink. They both just continued to stare at me with those wide, artificial smiles. Elias leaned forward, his face inches from mine, and his voice dropped to a low hum. "Is the hospitality sufficient? Are we being neighbors?" I didn't answer. I stood up so quickly that the plastic chair flipped over. I didn't apologize. I sprinted back through the empty living room and fumbled with the front door. As I burst out into the night air, I looked back through the window. Elias and the woman hadn't moved. They were still sitting at that folding table, staring at the empty chair where I had just been sitting. I went home and locked every window. The next morning, the blue sedan was gone. I walked over to the house and peered through the glass. The curtains were gone. The folding table was gone. The house was a vacant shell once again. I later found out the house was legally unoccupied. No one had rented it. To this day, I don't know who or what invited me to dinner. But I do know that whenever a new neighbor moves in now, I don't go over with a welcome basket. I stay inside. I keep my lights low. And I never, ever accept an invite.